ESG has exploded into compliance and business consciousness in 2021. Join Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, on the ESG Report and learn about sustainability risks, opportunities, and issues that business leaders and compliance professionals need to know about regarding ESG.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode of the ESG Report. This is actually part two of a two-part episode I'm having with Trysha Daskam. Trysha is the head of ESG strategy at Silver, a premier provider of regulatory compliance, ESG, and due diligence advisory services to the investment management industry. In part one, we took a look at some of the regulatory shifts around ESG, both in the United States and EU, the attention paid to these issues by the Biden administration and G7. And we talked about some of the trends for investor disclosures and issues that are important to investors. And today we're going to start off by talking about those seeking investment, whether it be companies seeking private equity funding, whether it be companies seeking institutional investors, could be institutions or rather companies seeking loans from financial institutions, or perhaps others. So Trysha, with that now incredibly long-winded introduction, first of all, welcome back.
Thanks, Tom. It's great to be here for part two.
So Trysha, we've talked about the regulatory aspect. We've talked a little bit about the investor aspect. But what do you see in your community around those companies seeking investment, from the small startup who may be looking at a Series A funding, all the way up to a company seeking investment from institutional investors, or perhaps large loans or other financial help from a financial institution? Where do you really see that part of the ESG journey?
I would tell you maybe a year ago that ESG was nice to have. Maybe even 2 years ago, I've told you that ESG is nice to have. And I think today we're really in an environment where ESG is a must. A firm needs to have a position on what their thoughts are around ESG risk. They need to have a position on how they're thoughtful about sustainability in their investment thesis, how they're thoughtful about the incorporation, integration, or other potential strategy utilizing ESG factors, as they're thoughtful about not only an investment strategy, but also how they're thinking about ongoing management of those investments after the initial either investment period, or as they're thinking about add-on acquisitions or increasing position size, et cetera. We're recognizing this pressure in numerous different parts of the industry. We're seeing placement agents really demand that managers give over their ESG practices, either in summary or in a complete policy, as it just relates to a package that placement agent will use in going out and vetting and looking and identifying potential investors, where placement agents are coming back to firms and saying, you must have this, and until you have this package is not complete. We're seeing high net worth individuals and non-institutional investors be very strong and firm in looking for and demanding a position on ESG as part of a request for information or a due diligence questionnaire. We're also recognizing that the tools for ESG in the industry are really starting to mature. We're seeing industry groups like AMA and organizational groups like PRI come out with numerous sort of action items and industry tools that firms can use if they haven't thought through what the starting point looks like. But I guess in total, or in summation, I think we're in a place where if you do not have a perspective on ESG, you're really behind at this point.
Trysha, that's one of the things that I find the most exciting about where we are now in terms of driving the ESG agenda forward, which is that if you want investment dollars, whether they come from institutional investors, private equity, high net worth individuals, financial institutions, or perhaps even shareholders, public corporations like you or me, you have to have that in your portfolio. So the next question or series of questions is perhaps, how does a company communicate their commitment, not simply their commitment to ESG, but that they actually have policies and procedures that can be monitored and tested and reported on? How do companies sort of market or advertise their commitment to ESG to the greater marketplace?
In general, we're seeing a trend toward managers having some reference to sustainability on their websites as an initial matter. It was historically the case that you could Google for ESG and insert name of large company here and come up with nothing. You couldn't identify whether or not they had a position on ESG, whether or not they had ever spoken about ESG. And that is really turning. We're recognizing just an unbelievable increase in managers adding this tab to their website, displaying what their overall practices are, looking through to see what it is that they value. But really importantly, Tom, I think this is coming in two different places. We're seeing firms come out in this sort of website facing realm on clarity around their corporate social responsibility practices, as well as their environmental social governance practices. And in our view, these are two very distinct and very different areas of focus for a firm. Environmental social governance and how firms view it is really an investment level process and an investment level practice. And that language and those communications should really focus on what's being done at the fund level. Corporate social responsibility, on the other hand, is what it sounds like. It lives at the corporate level, it lives with the corporate entity, and it describes or proscribes what the corporation is doing, maybe to further its ESG goals that exist at the fund level, or maybe to create alignment with its ESG goals, given that many of our investment managers look very different than the investments that they ultimately make. And that's definitely been step one. In addition, we're seeing a huge trend toward marketing decks, including an overview of ESG practices, potentially ESG case studies. Equally, seeing firms that have had a practice of evaluating, monitoring, and obtaining ESG-related information from either their investments or their portfolio companies on any routine or regular basis, provide a summary of that data on usually what's an annual basis through an annual general meeting or an annual investor letter. And then that information then becomes collateral of the firm to be used in potentially prospect conversations, et cetera. Those are the main areas where we see it. I would hesitate to tell you that it's common practice for firms to give over their ESG policy on their websites. We do see certain firms doing this specifically, and I know this organization's name has come up numerous times in our conversations, but specifically firms that have or are signatories to the PRI. One of the questions that every PRI signatory is required to respond to if you're an investment manager or asset owner is whether or not you make your commitment to responsible investment public. And then as part of your reporting requirements, you need to provide a website link where the staff of the PRI can go and review and make sure that those statements around public availability are true and accurate. And as a result, we've seen, at least as an initial matter, PRI signatories really trend toward publicly posting, if not a snapshot of their policy, their full policy. And then equally, that has led to a trend in ESG reporting where firms that have, again, had maybe an ESG practice in place for a year or so, putting out an annual report or biannual report on their greatest ESG challenges as well as their greatest ESG achievements. In all cases, we're mindful that ESG communications are subject to the marketing and advertising rules in the same way that any other communication of a firm is subject. And so where a firm wants to show a really strong ESG story, then in order to be balanced, it must also show an equal ESG challenge. And so seeing those types of writings come into public space more and more frequently, not only because of investor pressure, but also because of peer pressure and also because of organizational pressure, where managers have signed on to any number of large organizations that are sort of accepted in the space as leaders right now.
Let me pick up on that last point, or one of the last points you made. It was around marketing and advertising trends that they had to meet certain regulatory requirements. And with this increased visibility of ESG, and certainly the regulators looking at potential disclosure rules and even potential enforcement actions for the failure to meet those regulatory rules, I wanted to ask if you might be able to highlight some of the key ESG risk areas you see, or perhaps the better question might be key ESG risk areas that you're getting questions on right now from your clients.
Absolutely. The SEC helped us out. We talked about this in our first session in their publication of an ESG risk alert earlier this year in April. And in that ESG risk alert, the staff identified what it felt were the main risks that managers face in implementing an ESG program. For our listeners, I think the most important things to think about in this context, and really what we see clients struggle with when they come to us initially, is how to put action behind what your ESG policy says. The Commission identified both a sort of a two-prong risk here: policies that were overly vague, in so much that at the end of the day, probably the policy is so qualified, if you did nothing, you were still not in violation of it, and policies that were proscribing practices that were not actually contemplated, that there was no ESG competency at the firm to manage, and that there was no action or documentation around. And so I can't overstate the simple importance, maybe simple is the wrong word, it seems simple, that you must do what your policy says. And we've always been of the mindset at our firm that it is better to have a policy that is very small in terms of its perspective, but is accurate, that you're actually able to accomplish. And to take that first iteration and build on it, and build in reporting and build in tools as you grow and as you build resources around the space. It is so much better, not only for your clients and for your firm, but also from a regulatory standpoint, to have policies that show what you do, and to have processes in place to ensure that that policy is checked in on, that it's regularly updated, that you assign responsibility of it to someone at your firm to ensure that someone is checking in on the practices you've said you're going to undertake. The greatest risk with any policy or procedure at a firm is that you would not be able to substantiate that you did what you said you were going to do, and that your investors expected that you were going to do. I can't overstate the risk that this is in this space. At the same time, there's a very interesting sort of evaluation, I think that's the right description, of what managers are doing and how they're thinking about ESG. Managers have been very quick to tell their ESG story because maybe an anchor investor indicated that they wanted them to have an ESG program in place. And I think from that perspective, it's been very easy for companies to overstate or to maybe overthink how far ESG could reach into their company. And this has led to a lot of what the industry refers to as greenwashing, where you're saying you're doing something that's really meaningful, but actually your activity doesn't lead to any sort of change. I think we forget that the point of policy is to put something into action, to affect some sort of change or to affect some sort of process. So I would ask that if you're a firm that has an ESG program that doesn't require anybody to do anything, then what is the point of that policy? Why even have it? I think that's a really good litmus test for whether or not your ESG program and your ESG policy are actionable and substantiable from the perspective of a regulatory risk.
So, Trysha, what do you see from investors and ongoing requests for ESG information, DDQs, annual meeting details, and even side letter agreements? What's going on in that realm?
There are a couple of standard DDQs that we see used over and over again, either as they exist or customized by the investor itself. The PRI LP DDQ is used almost ubiquitously. The ILPA DDQ is also used by significant numbers of investors and allocators. And these two DDQs are relatively easy to come by. You can search for them and identify the questions to be asked. There are many investors who will take those questions and customize them. And then I think it's really important to recognize that global trends really inform what investors are looking for. So in a time of COVID, we saw numerous questions coming from the investor base in terms of how COVID-19 was managed and how that implicated either an ESG program or a corporate social responsibility program. We see a really, really specific focus from investors coming out on diversity, equity, and inclusion, asking not only how managers are thinking through this area, and then how managers are also evaluating whether or not the investments that they're making have a program or protocol around DE&I. I think that the manager body or the investment managers among us have a lot of resources available in terms of understanding how questions are going to come. More and more often, we see side letter agreements taking into consideration how a manager will or will not expose a particular investor to certain types of investments. Often that's in our space referred to as either negative screening or exclusionary screening. And then managers have an obligation to ensure that if they make an investment, that particular investor is either exempt or otherwise not subject to being exposed to that particular asset. There is absolutely a trend in frequency of these requests. we used to see that ESG DDQs were maybe sent at the onset of a relationship. And now I think it's pretty normal for managers to receive ESG DDQs as part of the annual check-in, if not even more frequently. We've seen one-off requests coming on only diversity. We've seen one-off requests coming only on climate. And absolutely, as your investors who are potentially domiciled somewhere else, so thinking about EU investors, as regulations around ESG shift and change in those spaces, then those investors are asking one-off questions around how the firm is managing, complying, or whether or not they are subject to these EU regulations. I guess better stated that it's a common practice or becoming a common practice for ESG to have a space in the annual general meeting, but I don't think that that is the same type of information that managers are sharing as part of these DDQs. I think more often annual general meeting details will cover the firm's overall approach to ESG, and then depending on what's being presented, maybe a snapshot of companies will share an ESG story, or maybe all companies will share an ESG agenda item. But it might still be as simple as one or two slides at the beginning. I think that there's still plenty of opportunity for ESG to make its way into an annual general meeting. But I think that needs to be thoughtfully done as well. So lots of different inputs where managers could be asked for reporting. And then, of course, I think managers have to be very thoughtful about what their ESG policy says. Very frequently, we see policies that have a reporting obligation that firms have just overlooked or never necessarily realized had an annual tie to it. And so I would also encourage you to go back to your policy and evaluate it. Is there an annual reporting obligation there that maybe you didn't appreciate in your first iteration? I think that sneaks up on people too.
Trysha, what do you see around the increase in ESG products, ESG indices, ESG funds, impact funds, et cetera? And what does this mean from an investment perspective?
In the United States, we have always been trending toward ESG integration as the strategy. In general, there are definitely ESG products here, but predominantly managers in the United States have taken on an ESG integration strategy. All that means is that managers have had a pre-existing investment strategy, and they've evaluated areas of opportunity where ESG could ultimately be inserted, and then an evaluation could be made that would be meaningful throughout the course of a fund investment, et cetera. In the EU, launching an ESG product is absolutely the first and foremost strategy in terms of evidencing or ultimately managing products under a sustainability umbrella. So we differ in that way. But over the last couple of years, we've noticed not only an increase in our clients suggesting that they might have interest in launching an ESG product, but also seeing the rise of additional ESG products coming out in numerous different ways. And then, of course, also recognizing a huge increase in benchmarking products. So just to name a few, we see Bloomberg's Gender Inequality Index. The S&P has its own sustainability indices. Thomson Reuters has similar data. And then, of course, we see data providers coming out with their own evaluation of public names across ESG methodology. I think the most well-known are things like Sustainalytics and RepRisk, who are evaluating public companies on a series of ESG metrics and then coming out with a score. All of these things, I think, create a landscape for firms to think through the tools that they can use to tell their ESG story more elegantly, to think through how reporting can be made more efficient, how to use the tools that are already available to you to either leverage what the ESG offering is. I think there are plenty of really cool things coming up, but at all times and in all circumstances, we really caution our clients to think about, why is it that you're using a tool? Why is it that you're using a data set? Does the methodology of that tool, does the methodology of that data set make sense to you in terms of your own ESG program? So for instance, if the Bloomberg Gender Inequality Index, if the threshold for inclusion in that index doesn't match your view on those topics, then using that as a benchmark is actually really meaningless for you. And so I think that as much as there are tools that are coming out into the space, I think we have to remember that those tools need to be vetted in the same way that using a new vendor you would vet. All of these pieces of ESG should feel really familiar to managers, and managers should think through the process of onboarding anything in the same way that they think about onboarding, a new prime broker or a new administrator, et cetera. So lots of opportunity, but lots of things to be careful of as well.
Trysha, I'd now like to turn to the service component that companies need to think about around ESG. And first of all, start off with, if you get a call or an email from a company who is seeking investment funds that's along the lines of where do we start, where does a company start around ESG?
I think that, there are numerous starting points here. I think that first and foremost, managers are really trying to understand whether or not their product offerings could be relevant in order to secure an allocation that's been earmarked for ESG funds. And this is a really interesting, I think, evaluation. First and foremost, managers need to evaluate whether or not their ESG policy is comprehensive in terms of addressing all of the assets under management, or if it was only contemplated for one particular strategy. I also think that managers need to think through whether or not they've been enticed to offer an ESG fund, or whether or not they've been thoughtful about offering an ESG fund in either scenario, if the methodology behind what that looks like can actually be maintained and then managed by the firm's skill set, right? So investment managers identify and hire their talent based on the investment thesis, and then experts around that investment thesis in order to manage and maintain the investments and to evaluate those investments over time. The introduction or adoption of an ESG product in order to either attract ESG dollars or to evidence how the full suite of assets are then covered by an ESG program, I think needs to be done really carefully. But absolutely, we get calls all the time from members of probably the investor relations community most often asking, what would we need to do in order to be competitive for investors who have an ESG mandate? I think we also have to be thoughtful about where that ESG mandate is coming from. If that ESG mandate, or rather if that manager or investor that has an ESG mandate is coming out of Europe, the standards are probably much higher in terms of what a manager needs to be doing to ultimately be deemed an ESG worthy investment. And a lot of that has to do with the regulation that's taking shape and the regulation that's the steps that managers are already taking in the EU in order to come in line with not only SFDR, but also the taxonomy regulation, both of which level 2 rules of SFDR are expected in January 2022, and initial compliance with the taxonomy regulation expected about the same time. I think managers need to be really thoughtful about where the ask is coming from, but I think it's enough of a question, or there's enough question in this area to recognize that there's an entire asset opportunity if you have the ability to attract ESG dollars, and there's enough earmarking going on for this class that if you haven't already adopted an ESG program, it's something, I guess, to think about in terms of the universe of your firm. But we would encourage you to be quite careful in developing a product in order to meet these requests, because there's a lot that could be behind them. In 2014, maybe you could have called an ESG fund, you could have named an ESG fund and had some intention to invest along certain ESG parameters, and that would have been sufficient. But today in 2021, that methodology, that investment thesis needs to be really defined. You're likely going to have to tie to one or many specific ESG factors with a particular intention around what your impact or ultimate contribution will be to those factors. And then, of course, thinking through investor disclosure in that capacity, then also being really thoughtful about what it would mean as a manager to launch an ESG product under the guise of contributing to an ESG factor. And then what if the fund doesn't perform? What happens? I think that there's a whole universe of things to be thoughtful of today that were not necessarily contemplated when this acronym was sort of making its way into the space. And we understand it so much more today, and we understand so much more about how managers are using it. So I hope that answered your question, Tom.
Trysha, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time. This has been a great series of podcasts, and frankly, I cannot think of a better way to start this podcast series on ESG to have this chance to visit with you over 2 episodes. I was wondering if our listeners wanted any more information on yourself or Silver, where could they go to find out, or any of the other topics you've talked about in these first 2 podcasts?
Thanks, Tom. My contact information and information about our firm and our practice areas is all available on our website. So I would encourage you to visit us at silverregulatoryassociates.com. My V card is available for download, and I would welcome anyone to reach out. This is a really fun conversation and a really compelling conversation. And I think we're in a really excellent space to be able to share what we've learned and to be able to continue the conversation.
Well, Trysha, I, for one, greatly look forward to continuing this conversation with you.
Thank you for having me, Tom. This has been a wonderful treat.